has asked me to introduce Tim Wilson, so I've quickly checked Wikipedia. Tim Wilson, Australian politician. Timothy Robert Tim Wilson, born 12th March 1980, is an Australian politician who's represented
Stein. In the
Australian House of Representatives. Since 2016 is a member of the Liberal Party. He's also a public policy analyst and commentator who is also a policy director at the Institute of Public Affairs, which is why I do remember you. He was subsequently the Australian Human Rights Commissioner from 2014 to 2016. I used to introduce Tim as Australia's last Human Rights Commissioner, hopefully. But apparently, because the Turnbull government hasn't quite abolished the Human Rights Commission yet, we're just waiting for that legislation to come through. So Tim is now, of course, a wonderful member of Parliament, a wonderful member for Liberty in Parliament, wonderful voice within the Liberal Party, and I'd like to welcome him to say some words about populism, apparently.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that very kind introduction. Chris, you missed the part in my official Wikipedia page that is written almost entirely by people, I think, on the left, because it seems to obsess about my strong opposition to plain packaging and my strong defence. Thank you, Sinclair. My strong advocacy for reform of 18C. But more recently, someone has written in a news section about my relationship with Andrew Hastie and standing up for religious liberty and the right of same-sex couples to marry, and it's riddled with spelling errors. So could somebody, because I'm not allowed to do it, could somebody go into my Wikipedia page and fix it? And then just actually improve it generally, because it's so clearly written by lefties who don't like me. Thanks, Chris, and thanks also to, I've got to acknowledge, this is what you have to do when you're in Parliament. I find it tedious, you're all dignitaries, but to acknowledge my, what's the word we should use for ourselves, David? We're not in the same, rent seekers alike. Fellow wankers, David Lionhelm and myself, but also particularly to John and Tim who brought this conference together. I actually went to the first Friedman conference many years ago, and it's actually, and I say this every year, but it's only because it's true, and it's actually becoming increasingly intimidating and scary how big it's getting and how much impact it is now having in bringing people from the broad liberty movement together to focus their minds, their energies on contemporary issues, and actually to try and then have an influence on the future of the country. And so for that, Tim and John and everybody else, I pay homage, because it's so important and we need it as a country right now, and that goes across the board, no matter whether you're at state or federal government or anywhere else. The voice of liberty is needed now more than ever. But today, I was asked to address the subject matter of freedom, not populism. And admittedly, I thought it was a very appropriate and apt time to do so, because I look at the liberty movement, not just here, but across the world, and I become increasingly nervous about what is occurring. What I see are people who have common bonds and common values seeking similar aspirations for their country, fragmenting and going, I think, increasingly down a dangerous political path from some segments in thinking they're somehow going to get some sort of edge ahead of one another. As many of you know, I strongly define myself as a liberal and not a conservative or a libertarian, and I spoke about it last night because I believe that liberal is the best word we have. It means freedom, it means openness, it means everything that we should aspire to as a people. And when you leave that word to be defined by others because you seek to brand elsewhere, you are leaving it there so that our dear friends, particularly on the political left and all of their various strands, can adopt it for their own nefarious purposes. But the other reason is because I believe we always have to be liberal in our outlook. What we've seen, and I expected Corey to be here and was going to say this while he was in the room, and he's a man I have actually quite a lot of time for, despite our very strong differences of opinions on some issues, is that when you define yourself simply by your conservatism, what you're actually doing is defining what you are against, and defining yourself as simply somebody who only seeks to temper change, because conservatism is not a vision, it's a virtue. And it's a virtue that I hold in wanting to drive change. You can be a socialist and be conservative. That's basically what we call Fabians. Without liberalism, conservatism by itself is not a political philosophy or a direction. You leave it to be the future to be defined by others and only make the choice and the pace at which you get there. And so I think that's incredibly problematic and incredibly dangerous for us if you care about liberty as part of a movement. But the other thing I'm very concerned about is the rise of what is not just identity politics on the left, but identity politics on the right. What you're seeing more and more of is people who seek to identify themselves through different strands of conservatism or nationalism is the idea that if you are part of a broad liberty movement, you too can be a victim. And then we're going to play the game of victimhood to try and justify our place in the world and why we should win arguments. And that is called fighting not just on your opponent's turf, but in practice amounts to giving up everything it is that we believe in the first place. The whole concept of formal equality from the outset, that people are born free and equal, and that the role of law is to preserve and protect that liberty. And what you end up doing is getting down in the dirt and having an argument with other people who are better at engendering a sense of sympathy and empathy for others and playing a game of power politics. And while, yes, sometimes you might have a valid point around some of the issues around power relationship, where the state can come along and force people to do things, and the classic example is the enduring debates around the role of anti-discrimination law. But in the end, you are fighting on your opponent's turf, and we have to be very mindful of that. What we need is politics from positions of principle, because that's the only way in which you get from a position of coherence. And this is where, David, I'm the first to concede, probably excels and beats me in the prosecuting from principle through to policy. But that's the luxury of being a senator from a minor party versus being part of a mainstream party that seeks to govern. That's a reality. And David's acknowledging, and yes. So nice. But that's the reality of how it works. But you need people in every part of the debate and every part of the discussion if you want to advance the cause of liberty in the process. And that it sits in the hearts and minds of everybody, not just within minor parties, but in major parties as well. And that we have to resist the easy temptation and the idea that we're somehow going to translate our philosophy into playing to an idea of victimhood. And that's what we're seeing a lot of, particularly in national populist movements around the world, including in Australia. And I point my finger particularly at Pauline Hanson's One Nation, whom I'm a very critical voice against. Because what they're trying to do is go around the country at the moment and sow seeds of doubt amongst people who traditionally believe in our values and believe in our culture and our way of life, and use it as the basis to form a political movement. Now, this isn't designed to be a partisan comment. It's supposed to be about a reflection on where the movement is. And that many people seem to want to embrace and adopt those ideas because they can see the opportunity of victimhood through the ideas that they espouse, rather than recognising the enduring strength of what we all believe in as individuals, but collectively, which is that freedom sits within a context. And that's what defines us and makes us different from so many other political movements, particularly the modern progressives, who are relativists often over different things that matter. That freedom requires certain institutions and certain cultures to survive, and that it must live in the hearts and minds of people. But it must continue to live in the hearts and minds of people to survive into the future. But if part of that requires the preservation of those institutions, which is why we stand up against political philosophies and cultures that seek to undermine it. But that shouldn't be a rallying call to victimhood or that we should feel insecure or threatened. We should stand tall, proud and confident, because that's the only way that we as a movement can stay together, continue to advance our values through the actions of Tim Andrews and others, or David Leyonhjelm or Tim Wilson, through the existing institutions of our free society. And that's a very high-level discussion, but I think it's very important because we have always started from our positions and principles and taken them through to policy. That's what makes us strong, and that's what makes us enduring and consistent, which is something we value perhaps in most of the body politic. And we have to make sure that we stand up and defend those values now if we want to have a future united so that we can be successful. I want to leave my remarks there because what I actually want is opportunity for questions, particularly because when we're facing this threat of populism and whatever different strand that now exists, we have to find a way to navigate through it together and defend those time-tested values and enduring principles if we want to be successful. Thank you. Ryan, you had your question up, your hand up before we even started.
Jim, as you probably know, through our Mankell Foundation, we're in touch with a lot of young people.
Yep.
Their view generally is that in Australia, politics is so bloody broken, they don't know where to start. The three things that you suggest would be what to repair the broken politics.
I agree and disagree. I think there's some bigger problems we have as a society and politics generally. We have politicians who sell quick fixes. Now, that's not a new thing, but the problem is the marketplace is doing such a spectacular job of meeting immediate need that everything the government does seems to take forever to achieve. And so this consumption behaviour that now operates in politics, which many politicians are feeding as part of the political culture, is feeding upon itself and making it harder to have trust in the institutions that exist. But I think one of the things that we have to do as a liberty movement generally is recognise that politics isn't about different solutions or different directions for the country. The art of politics and being successful is how we define problems and framing questions. And what we've allowed, and partly because in Australia too many people have identified themselves with their conservatism and what they're against, in my view, we have allowed other people to frame the questions. And so framing the questions necessarily leads itself to the obvious conclusions. And take something Ken Phillips works on in industrial relations, where you can have an industrial relations system and ask, how do we design one that distributes the benefits to working people, and you'll come up with a particular type of industrial relations system. And we know that's broadly the way that centre-left parties work, because they're only interested in those people who work, and hell to the rest of them and people are unemployed who want to get into work. And we just pay them off with unemployment benefits. Or you can ask broadly, how do we have an industrial relations system that seeks to achieve broadly full employment? And that's broadly what many of the people on our side of the political fence, whatever stripe you may fit into, and leads you to a necessary conclusion. And we have to make sure that in advancing and standing up for what we believe in, which is freedom, which is positions of policy from principle, but that we're using those opportunities to frame the questions that we want discussed, rather than leaving other people to set the agenda and us simply tempering the speed at which they get there, which means we're naturally oppositionist and opposed to what's happening, which means many young people, I think, are interpreting us as being against change and against the future. Thank you. Ken first, then I don't know you, so... Subject, okay.
Well, the comment to me before wasn't I've had quite extensive discussions with One Nation people as doing advocacy work. I talk to as many as I can. And one of their key demographic that is pulling their vote are genuine victims.
Yeah.
And so we've got victims, farmers, who have had their property rights stolen from them through the environmental process and the banning of their capacity to use their property to advance their farms and to clear land and so on and so forth. And they have had individuals who have had hundreds of thousands of dollars ripped off from them without compensation from the state because of state laws that are being imposed upon top of it.
Yeah.
So these people are genuine victims, and they are victims of the institutions. So the rise of something like One Nation that is appealing to genuine victims who are victims of the failure of the institutions explains a heck of a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm nowhere near, once understanding where One Nation is coming from, I'll tell you what, they could well and truly be in this room because they'd be agreeing with us. And we shouldn't be surprised at what's happening when you get a dysfunctional institution screwing people.
Ken, on that point, I don't think that explains the whole phenomenon of populism, but I do agree with you because I think there, with certainly large parts of it, because and this is where I'm nervous about this framing of this idea of victimhood, is that there are legitimate people who are victims and there are people who want to be victims. And it's something that's seeped into our culture across the board. We're seeing this more and more where people of faith traditions in Australia and the same in the US are now claiming a victimhood status. Now, sometimes the government might be coming along and saying, doing things against them which isn't a violation of their liberty, but sometimes that is not the case, and they just feel, frankly, a lot of religious people are starting to feel like how some religious movements have treated other people and minority groups in the past. But if we're to continue to preserve the institutions and the culture of freedom that has built modern Australia, we have to fix those institutions to make sure that they're not doing exactly what they are doing. Take, for example, the one you gave up, you talked about in property rights. And that's missing. That's completely missing from the dialogue and the discussion. And in the end, populist parties aren't often the solution to that problem because they're not actually focused on the integrity, the importance. They're interested in feeding the resentment. And we, as those who believe in liberty, have to focus on rebuilding and refocusing those institutions so that they're doing so. But that requires actually getting out there and articulating the case of what they're supposed to do, why they're important, as we always have and always should be doing. Because if not, it's simply defined by our dear friends on the left who have used environmental regulations to primarily justify encroachments on property rights, and will continue to do so. If our choice is to completely bypass those debates and just defend property rights without actually articulating the case, they'll always win.
Yeah.
All right.
So there's been a lot of calls lately from the more right-wing community to either abolish or significantly curtail the Human Rights Commission. So in your ideal liberal society, not the reality of getting elected, but the ideal society, is there room for a Human Rights Commission, and how would it operate and what would its function?
Funnily enough, I actually get asked this question all the time. Well, there's no easy answer. I mean, there's a difference between what happens when an institution doesn't exist and whether it's created, and what happens when it does exist and whether it has a place. There is work that the Human Rights Commission can do in certain circumstances that can actually be useful for advancing the cause of liberty. The problem is that there's plenty of things that they could be doing on the other side of the ledger that isn't. Because it's actually not a Human Rights Commission. It's really a Human Rights and Social Justice Commission. And if you actually look at the structures, there's 6 commissioners who are dedicated to social justice and 1 commissioner responsible for human rights and freedoms. That's how it works. So unsurprisingly, 6 on one, 1 on the other. Let's just say the scales of justice and liberty don't tend to favour the way we'd like it to do. But there is a role for commissioners from government from time to time to bring together people to actually have discussions, but they actually have to broadly be consistent with what the government's seeking to focus and advance, but doesn't have to be permanent. No, I don't think that's true. There's no justification for that. In fact, commissioners without some sort of focus and mandate from government to go and try and solve X problem or Y problem are just wandering public policy advocates, which, by the way, was what I was for 2 years. The only difference was I was always focused on how to advance the cause of liberty, and my fellow commissioners, many of whom I have a very fond relationship with still to this day, but were focused on how to advance social justice, and often at the expense of liberty.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure, then Graham. Darren.
Yeah. Is there a confusion between populism with discontentment, and which is really a manifestation about the lack of debate?
Well, there's more debate now than ever. What there is crap debate a lot of the time. You see, and you just pick up the Fairfax Press most of the time, and you just see article after article framed against what we believe in, and this is why I keep pointing, it's about framing and the question asked, not the answer given, and trying to indoctrinate and enculturate people into the idea that everything is about power, everything is about social justice, and if you're not articulating a solution based on social justice, you're basically not delivering a credible position. And you see this all the time where, well, you're a white man, and these days I can't say with absolute confidence that you're white or you identify as white, but I'm presuming you're a white man, and I'm going to project that onto you, by the way. And therefore, just by highlighting that, your humanity is actually diminished. And the reason and the weight and irrelevance of your argument is diminished because of your existing power position. And I think that is what's driving a lot of people's resentment, particularly against political correctness, because political correctness has gone from being something about trying, or at least originally advocated, to advance the idea that you should exercise a bit of caution and respect towards your fellow person, your fellow human being, to now actually being a point of disrespect. an actual contempt for who you are in your life journey and the justification for you holding an argument. And so I think that feeds into a sense of resentment and victimhood as well, of which the left are entirely responsible for in the past and I imagine will be in the future. So do I think that's a problem? Resolutely, yes. And is that different from populism? Yes, it is. But what we're seeing is more and more populists going to seek to feed that identity and feed that sense of victimhood for electoral gain, which means that they're actually abandoning the values and turning a lot of people who identify as conservative into a new form of conservative victimhood. And that's when conservatism stops being about taking the best of the past forward and the institutions and the culture forward, and instead focusing on victimhood.
Do politicians underestimate the intelligence of the electorate?
A lot of politicians underestimate the intelligence of the electorate all the time. Not enough people are... this is a dangerous thing. I'm actually going to quote Toby Ziegler from The West Wing, which was, basically a left-wing political show. But he made the point that our job should be not to appeal to the lowest common denominator, it should actually be to raise it. And I agree with that. And we don't do very much of that. And more digestible sound bites are being used as a vehicle to shape how politics is communicated. But too often and I keep coming back to this point, we're fighting on our opponent's turf because they're framing the question. And once they frame the question, the answer leads itself to where we end up to. Graham.
Tim, I have a problem with this term populism.
Yep.
I suspect it doesn't have any sort of a definition that would stand up to any sort of intellectual rigour, and that it's more a term of abuse used about people who happen to be garnering some percentage of the vote and whose supporters you think aren't smart enough to have an opinion. In my view, that's democracy.
Yep.
And you did mention the word threat. I'd suggest that a lot of the populists around the world today are actually on our side of the fight and fighting for liberal values. So Pauline Hanson, and I admit to a slight defect in having created her accidentally in the first place, One Nation is about equality. One Nation is anti-victim politics. That's why she chose the word or the name One Nation. That populist on the other side of the Pacific, if I'd been an American, I would have voted for him for two reasons. One, he'll fix the system with the judges and bring back more a black letter law approach. And on climate change, he's actually on the pro-science side of the argument. And a lot of those so-called populists, or the people that he attracted, they might not understand why they're on that side of the argument, but I think they're on the right side of the argument. So I'd just like you to...
Well, populism is political values without principle. It's popular at the time because it reflects what people's sentiments or concerns are, and therefore you do it. Well, there's populism. There's populisms in all political parties, but whether they define their movement and their values behind what their core motivating force is ultimately reflects the degree of populism which they're prepared to embrace. And One Nation is not alone in this. I need to stress that. But you're right, many of the people who do support many of the values are standing up for things like One Nation, are talking about things like equality, but they're often talking about it on their terms as well. One Nation has a mixed view on some issues of equality from time to time, as do other political movements. But fragmentation and going off and embracing that and matching it with populism, because they can go out and talk about why they don't like Muslims in a country that actually has in its constitution religious liberty, and don't seem to ever want to separate out the fact that there are Islamist extremists and there are mainstream people who just happen to have a religious tradition which is anchored in the Quran, are feeding a caricature and an idea of certain people to demonise them in exactly the same way lefties are to invalidate Darren's argument simply because he's white. And it's this dehumanisation that I think is incredibly problematic. And if you feed that and encourage that as part of your core central political narrative, then it won't... it does nothing to advance the cause of liberty in the end.
Can I suggest quoting Martin Luther King's speech in Parliament, I have a dream, of identity politics?
What around people being judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. Well, exactly right. And you're seeing a lot of it, and it's across the board now, where people want to silence and shut people up because of their because they say something on Twitter, and they want people to lose their jobs. And that's been said on both sides of the political argument because people are buying into these populist ideals and left-wing populist solutions to problems as well. Tim Andrews gave me the wound up, so unfortunately I have to end it there. Thank you.
Good.